Welcome to the Reasons to Reason podcast. I'm your host and captain, Sal Galati. This is the show that's going to talk about all the things we're not supposed to: God, religion, and politics. So strap in, prepare to get offended, and maybe, just maybe, our nation can learn how to reason again. Thanks for joining us for another episode. You know, this show's kind of making relationships, which is cool. So a friend of mine from work's buddy is listening to the show, and he's a young man who's seeking. And we've had an opportunity to talk on the phone a few times. And I love just talking to him because he's an honest-hearted kid just trying to figure out what's true, what's not. And I introduced him to a book called Case for Christ. It's by Lee Strobel. And this is a guy that was a skeptic and investigated the claims of the New Testament as far as the resurrection, talking to all kinds of professionals in different areas. He's an attorney by trade, an investigative journalist with the Tribune. And he came to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, which, as remarkable as it sounds, is a pretty earth-shattering revelation. That said, I gave this book to Rich, and I thought I wanted to go through this book as an episode, and I thought, how cool would it be to have us go through the book, but from his take? And I told him, give me your best 3 pieces of evidence that you took from it, you know, what your thoughts are on it, and just tell us about your journey that you're on. So I want to introduce you to Rich Goals.
Thank you, Sal. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you on this journey and all of your advice and the conversations we've had. Really enjoying it, so thank you. So, really a little bit about my background and why I started seeking and looking into this. I was never really raised religious, but I was very much raised with a deep-seated sense of morality. I attribute that to my father, and that's really continued to this day. I think a lot about the nature and nurture debate, but the sense that I feel of that there is, absolute good and right in the world seems to me to be much deeper than, just something your parents ingrained in you. And I guess I'm sort of starting to seek now for a couple of reasons. I had a little bit of exposure to organized religion when I was younger. I was not raised in any sort of religious tradition, but I did attend a Catholic high school my freshman year of high school. And, to kind of prepare for that, my dad and I read the Bible together. And I honestly was a little bit discouraged by the whole experience. I just felt like a lot of the lessons that seemed to be very clear and very helpful were just not put into practice. The last shall be first and the first shall be last, and the priest was driving a BMW. Just didn't quite make sense to me and sort of, turned me off in the organized religious experience. But unfortunately, when I was 15, my father passed away and had a significant struggle with that and with alcoholism in my family. And, kind of more recently, my brother was diagnosed with a severe brain tumor and also has his first kid just as a couple of months ago. And, finding that I'm not capable of handling all of this alone. And that may sound selfish that you're starting to seek now, but it plays into the feeling that I think there is something greater out there and something objectively right or wrong that gives more meaning to this whole thing.
I want to interject here for a sec. I don't think it's selfish at all. I think what happens in life, and as you go through things, one of the things God hates the most is pride. And the reason why he hates pride is because it keeps you from seeing that you need help. And so, especially when you're a young man and you got everything going for you and you're starting to be successful, your work, whatever, you're strong, your body's working good, it's hard to think you need help. But when you get to the end of your rope is when you look up. You mentioned moral law, and that's pointing you towards that there has to be a moral lawgiver. There has to be an absolute. It can't just be some arbitrary thing that exists outside of a writer of that law. That is the argument that has brought most of the great thinkers over time to the truth that God must be real. And another thing, I've come up with a little saying that religion is to God as politics is to governance. And so what do I mean by that? God is true, God is good, God is necessary. The religion is what clouds you from seeing it, seeing him, understanding him, the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. And as you go through the New Testament, you're going to see that over and over again. And then also, governance is good. We need governance. We need order. But politics is the garbage. Politics is the disorientation, the distraction, the confusion. It keeps proper governance from able to take shape. So, and as far as the stuff going on in your life, I mean, we could talk about that maybe off board. I had my dad died about a year ago, and we're going to do an episode about that. And the way I came to faith was through my wife filing through divorce, and we're going to do an episode on that too. And again, it points to these things. If we have a loving Father in heaven that loves us, he might put us through things sometimes for us to see for our best good. And I can't tell you right now what that is. I can say right now is from a human perspective, you're seeking, that's good. For your brother, again, we could talk about that. And sometimes we don't understand it, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a good intention behind it. Just like a parent sometimes has good intention for their kid and the kid doesn't understand it. Just because, we're a people and he's God.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that and totally agree. Sort of the most interesting thing for me on this journey has been the shattering of my preconceived notions about, what Christianity was about, what Christ was about, and kind of a feeling that, a lot of the important stuff that's become convincing for me on this path doesn't really seem to be talked about very much in organized religion. The first piece of evidence that Strobel talks about in the book is the fact that the Gospels, as historical documents, are some of the most corroborated and considered reliable of any historical document around the same time. And there are a few reasons for that. I think it's interesting to compare them to the other historical documents that historians consider to be reliable. The first is that the Gospels were recorded very, very shortly after Christ's life. And this is important because, when studying historical documents, there's something known as legendary development, where over time, over the generations, as, an oral tradition or written tradition is passed down, there tend to be, embellishments, things that are exaggerated. And the further you are from that person's life and the people who knew them directly in their life, the more likely that is to happen. So what's unique about the Gospels is we know that the first writings are really within about 35, 40 years of Jesus' life. In comparison, the first biographies of Alexander the Great were written about 400 years after his life, and those are considered reliable. So they're a much, much abbreviated time as to when these Gospels were first recorded. They have scraps of material from the year 100 to 150, and then the number of copies that are available is also staggering compared to other historical documents. So something like 5,000 Greek manuscripts with some portion or another of the Bible, which, you compare to Homer's Iliad, and there are about 600 of those copies available. And I just find that staggering, that it is so corroborated. There is, so much writing that zeroes in on the core principles of the Gospels and it is not contradictory in sort of the most important pieces.
One thing I'll say, if we have 5,000 copies of something right now, that's not a big deal. You can make 5,000 copies instantly. But the fact that, you find a copy of it that's from 100, if there's thousands of copies of it, then the historians have a way of figuring out, how long ago was the original? And that's how they get it really close. There's also some passages within some of the New Testament letters that read like creeds. And that's indicative of the fact that, it was an oral society. You didn't really write things down. Many people didn't have the means to, but you would document things by creed, a lyrical way of saying it. So they could tell it's a lyrical creed. And that also shows you that it had been a tradition that was around even before the letter was written. It gets you even closer to the date. A couple of things Rich mentioned that I'm loving he's seeing. We almost have to unreligiousize our mind when we're trying to look at this evidence. I make the joke that what people know about Christianity comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. And we just the world has seated in our head what the Bible says. And then when you actually read it, you're like, oh, that's wildly different. There's another friend of mine that's defiantly atheist, and we talk about Jesus, and he'll just scoff and mock and whatever. And then the other day he told me he's reading a book about Jesus. And I go, oh, really? Which one? And it's some recent book written about him, but it's written by a Marxist who's trying to make Jesus out to be a communist, and it's obviously got an agenda. He wouldn't even admit what it was, but I sent him a picture of the title and he didn't respond, which tells me that I got the book. But I joked with him and I said, if you're serious about knowing what Jesus said, why wouldn't you look to books that were written right at his time by people that knew him versus one that was written thousands of years later? But that just shows he's not a serious person, right?
And that's interesting. Part of, what I've realized on this journey is I certainly probably would have said that I was an atheist 5-10 years ago, certainly in college, end of high school, a bit nihilistic maybe even. As I've aged, I've realized that position was really not based in any sort of fact or truth or reality. It was just sort of the loose belief that, God just doesn't seem scientific or like something believable, whereas the Big Bang and evolution is. And I think the more you think about it, the more you realize that that is not the case. There is no reason to believe that to be more realistic than a creator.
Yeah, when we use this word religion, I always say, like, I'm not religious. I'd argue those positions are religious. And a lot of us have had that kind of worldview because whether we understand it or not, that's what was baked into our heads through the media, the culture, and the education system. And we never really questioned it because it was presented as fact. Look, the serious scientists know that these things aren't true. Now, many don't know in the culture. Culturally, a lot of people accept this, but it's a religion that's been planted in our head. And yeah, it's not based in any kind of reality. As soon as you poke at it a little bit, it all falls apart. I'll let you get to your next most convincing point from the book.
Yeah, and to kind of step back just briefly on the reliability historically of the Gospels, the amount of corroborating evidence in other historical documents that describe Jesus' life, his crucifixion, in one way or another is also very convincing. Several historians around the year 100 wrote about his life in one way or another, and the fact that that is corroborated in so many places, I think, is very convincing. One of the most interesting examples of that corroboration that I found personally is the story about basically the earth going dark while Jesus was being crucified. Theories were that, maybe it was a solar eclipse or something like that, but there are actually contemporary documents from a couple different places in the world and a couple well-known historians that describe observing that phenomenon at the time Christ was crucified. And obviously the way an eclipse works, it's specific to a certain vantage point that you have. So the fact that it's described as being observed in different places in the world around the same time, I just found to be very, very interesting. I think the next piece of evidence that I found very compelling was what Strobel refers to as the fingerprint evidence. Essentially, is the Messiah, does he have the characteristics that Jesus Christ had, or vice versa? Does he claim to be the Messiah? Does he fit the picture of the Messiah as described in the Old Testament? And I thought that was fascinating because of all of the prophecies that, essentially Jesus fulfilled. A lot of these are, or some of them anyway, it's possible that you could do it intentionally, like riding a donkey into Jerusalem. But there are several that Jesus would have absolutely no control over, like his manner of birth, the fact that it was a virgin birth, his place of birth in Bethlehem, his ancestry, the fact he was a descendant of Abraham, his manner of death, crucifixion, which is described in the Old Testament and had not been invented at the time of that writing. One of the scholars had calculated the probability of someone just coincidentally meeting those criteria, and meeting 8 of the 48 predictions is a chance of 1 in 100 million billion, and calculating the probability that someone would meet all 48 is an unimaginably large number. I'm definitely someone who's very convinced by math and statistics, and I've always found them fascinating. And I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at the probability that Christ was who he claimed to be.
So to be fair, a lot of these prophecies, and I have some Jewish friends that we go back and forth on these prophecies, and they'll argue that, well, he didn't really fulfill this one. That's not really what it meant. I'll just say this, couple items. We believe as followers of Jesus that he's going to come again. And a lot of Jewish people don't say, well, where does it say that in the Bible? Well, it doesn't say that per se, but it says that in another way. It says it because it describes Messiah being born in Bethlehem, son of David. And it also describes Messiah coming on the clouds at some point, which, interestingly enough, Jesus came first, born in Bethlehem, crucified, ascended, and we're told he'll come again on the clouds. So it's a way, sometimes these prophecies, we don't even understand how they will be fulfilled until we see them fulfilled. And Isaiah 53 is like the most well-known one, and I'm sure Rich has read it now. I mean, you send this to everybody, they assume it's from the New Testament because it so clearly describes the life and what Jesus went through in the crucifixion. This is written by the prophet Isaiah hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. And what's interesting is that was always considered to be messianic, but now they're called polemics. Essentially, it's a reinterpretation of the scriptures by sages or rabbis to say it's not really messianic anymore. It actually means this or it means that. And this isn't a show about debating all that, but there's a source called, I'll share it with you, One for Israel, and these are all Jewish believers in Jesus. They know Hebrew, they study Hebrew, and they go through the history of kind of where the sages fell on these prophecies, and they kind of unpack that in a very fair way. They provide both sides of the argument, and then ultimately with all these things, like you decide, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And one of the other, sort of pieces of fingerprint evidence that struck me as the most interesting was I would have assumed that throughout history there were tons of people claiming to be the Messiah or claiming to be divinely inspired or put there by God. And, while there are certainly some, it's simply not the case that there were many that even make the same claims that Jesus makes as being the Messiah. There are a couple, stories of rabbis performing certain miracles, things like that, but there really is no historical precedence for somebody claiming to be the Messiah and the Son of God and sent in this way.
Actually, the New Testament's document, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin are kind of debating what to do with this Jesus figure. And most of them want him crucified and removed. Others, though, said, look, we've had false prophets, false messiahs, and where are they now? They kind of fizzle out. The leader gets killed or imprisoned, and the movement falls apart. He said, if this one's sent from God, it'll manifest itself. We don't have to destroy it. God will destroy it. And interestingly enough, despite all the persecution that the Christian movement went through, and which is another evidence, I don't know if that's going to be one of the evidence you provided, but the fact that his followers that knew whether or not he did rise from the dead, they were there, they were all willing to be martyred. They were all willing to be killed, banished, crucified, fed to lions, burned. People don't do that. It's not a thing people do. There's another guy that came to faith. His name's J. Warner Wallace, and one of the things he says is he studies cold cases, and he came to faith by studying the resurrection as like a cold case, 2,000-year-old cold case. And he goes, I know why people lie. It's for sex, money, or power. They don't lie to be crucified. Mm-hmm. And that was a very convicting bit of info.
Right, and I found that to be one of the most convincing pieces as well, is, it's very possible someone would die for something that they believe in, but are not, certain about, didn't witness firsthand, but they still believe it. But the fact that so many people allowed themselves to be persecuted so severely when they would have known better, I think is incredibly compelling because, to your point, what do they have to gain? Certainly not worldly possessions or riches at the time. It was a brutal death. And the fact that these people would have known if they were lying and stuck with that till the end, I think is very, very convincing. I also find it very, very interesting that a lot of the counter arguments that are presented in the book and, generally in the research I was doing that kind of argue against the crucifixion are, I would have expected to be, well, there's no real proof Jesus ever existed, and of course the crucifixion didn't occur in that way, and so on and so on, but those are not the counterpoints because those are not credible positions. There is just a ton of evidence for the fact that this actually happened, and to the point where, even the detractors at the time were not arguing that, oh, Jesus was actually never buried in the tomb, and, the arguments were relegated to, well, somebody stole the body. So even the detractors at the time were fully admitting that Jesus was buried in his tomb and that his body was not there several days later. And the fact that that's what's being debated as opposed to, whether any of this happened in the first place, I think is evidence in itself that something really did happen.
One thing I want to interject here real quick, Rich and I were talking before we started recording, and just, like he's going through this experience I had like 10 years ago. I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and nothing against the Catholic Church per se, just I didn't hear any of this stuff. And how thirst quenching it was when I started coming across these things. And Rich is experiencing the same thing now. It's like, why hasn't anyone told me this? And the only logical conclusion, and we've talked about this on the show before, there's a spiritual element here. And I mean, the Bible describes it as people having a veil over their eyes. They cannot even see it. And when that veil is removed, it's so clear to you, and then you're trying to share it with other people, and they don't see it. But what other explanation would there be for not hearing these things until you just seek a little bit, or someone mentions to it, or situation happens in your life where you're finally at the point where you're like, okay, I'll look into that. Because that's the world too. The world distracts you with pleasures or good times or whatever, making you think like all life is about is going on vacations and buying a nice car, buying a nice house. Even good things like getting married and having children are all good things, but they're all, without God as the anchor, they're all meaningless. I think Rich is a serious enough person to understand this whole thing is a joke if we just roam around here for 80 years and then end up in a box. If that's the reality, so be it. I don't believe it's the case, but let's call it what it is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if there is no higher purpose or objective right and wrong, then, the struggle is kind of futile. It's, what's the point? Why not just lie, cheat, and steal and get ahead? But the fact that I feel so opposed to that on such a deep level, I find to be pointing towards the fact that there is a higher power here and there is some objective sense of those things.
That's why in the Bible describes it. Even if you've never seen or read the Bible, God made you and he wrote it on your heart. That's why you know. That's why the guy in the Amazon forest has the ability to know right from wrong. And when he does wrong, what's obviously wrong, there is moral absolutes. We know that. If you want to deny it, you're just kind of lying to yourself, because if you acknowledge that there's moral absolutes, you're acknowledging there's a moral lawgiver. And that's really the tension. That's what people don't want to face.
Exactly. And I mean, that is that's a very inconvenient truth. If you haven't been living your life that way, you see a lot of people who do live their life that way and essentially turn to Christ on their deathbed, because it gets serious and you start to realize that there's a real likelihood that there is something else out there. And if there is, I better make right with God and with Jesus. Going back to your point around how this stuff isn't really talked about or certainly in my exposure to religion, which is limited, but, a year in Catholic high school, the fact that I never really heard about any of this, I think is really surprising. And, if I were to teach religion, or I don't think the opening line would be, well, you should believe in Jesus, otherwise you're going to hell. I think it should be, you should believe in Jesus because there is real evidence that he was a real person and is the Son of God. But I think starting it from, being almost intentionally overly supernatural and not grounded in the real historical evidence, I think you would convince a lot more people by taking a more historical approach.
So a distinction I always want to make is like, what I believe is not religion. I'm not a religious person. And so I'm pursuing the truth. And obviously Christianity always gets lumped into a religion. But here's how it's different. I believe in an historical event. Religion is gender fluidity. That's religion. It's not based on science or reality. It's based on emotion. And as soon as you contest someone on it, they get emotional and it's dogmatic, right? Well, they've decided this is true and don't argue with my religion. That's not the case with Christianity. You'll meet heartfelt Christians will always want to discuss and look and critique and evaluate and make sure that they got it right. They're an open book when it comes to that. As far as like what happened to you in Catholic school, it could be very well that the people teaching you didn't really believe it. This is a difference. Like, people get offended by Christians who try to share the gospel and say, like, don't convert me. Convert is a weird word. Convert means like, I'm trying to change you. I'm not trying to change you. I'm trying to tell you the truth. You have a set of beliefs that you've based on not really looking at the evidence. So it's not a matter of conversion. It's a matter of sharing the truth with people and allowing them to arrive at their own conclusions. At this point, I want to share the gospel clearly with you and just have you hear it and have you like think about it and respond, because it's not religion. Right? It's a reality. I believe these things happen, and I'll share with you what the ramifications are of it. And if you believe the event happened, and then understanding what does it mean for you. So we have this situation where you've kind of alluded to it, like right from wrong in your heart without even reading the Bible. And you don't do what is right all the time. You might have not done what was right this morning already, and so what's up there? Why can't we get it right? So the world and most religions here's a system of getting yourself right. Whether it's a religion that has a God in it and you're trying to get yourself right with God by being good and doing the right thing and having enough good in your good column and more good in your good column than bad in your bad column, or an atheistic religion like many religions are, where you're trying to achieve a nirvana, a peace, unity with the environment, whatever it is, right? It's all trying to chase something by doing something.
Right.
So this great God, we're all fallen short. So what can be done? If you have a totally merciful and just God, how does he fulfill that? How does he make things right? He's just, so he can't just look the other way and let you off the hook. Someone's got to pay. But he's also merciful. So he wants to allow you to come back into him, to be united with him. So what does he do? He sends his son to bear the sins of the world on his back so that the vengeance is paid, the debt is paid. And that's why Jesus on the cross said it's finished. And that is offered to everyone now. So that when you meet God, it's not about what you did, Rich, and how good you are. It's about how good his son is. And that's who he sees. All the religions of the world going, do this, do that, you'll get right with God. Here's what our loving God does. He goes, I've made it right. Now do something good. We have a basis. We have a rock to stand on to do good. We want to do good to please, show gratitude to this loving Father that didn't have to do that. How does that make you think? What do you think?
Well, the first reaction that I have to that is that it's beautiful, and I want to believe that there is a creator out there who loves us that much and cares to have a personal relationship with us that much to do something like sacrificing your son. It obviously shows that God knows that we're flawed and that we're unable to fix that on our own, but that he wants us to be better and that he is trying to show us the way to be better and to do his will. I just find that to be so beautiful. I think everybody would love to loved that way, but I think it's just such an amazing gesture. It really struck me on a deep level, the concept of somebody doing that.
Like, the amazing part of it is the grace of it, and that came up in the last episode, is because he loves you before you do the good. While you were still sinners, he did this. While you were still separated from him, he did it for his enemies. So don't think you could earn his love. You'll never be able to earn it, or his forgiveness. You have it, embrace it, live that way. Because if this is true, you have everything. All the stresses of the world. And that doesn't mean, look, your brother's struggling with brain cancer. That's a real thing. I'm not trying to dismiss any of that. But if you put it in a perspective of you have eternity with the Father, it melts. And it's not just a psychological trick. If it's true, it melts.
Absolutely.
And for your brother, I don't know where he's at, to share this truth with him, to bring him that peace, whether, we pray for restoration, we pray for healing, but ultimately the prayer is we want to be united with the Father in eternity.
Absolutely. And, I don't want to say that, and I certainly wouldn't say that, that means that nothing that happens on earth matters. I mean, it clearly does, and God and Jesus clearly care how you live your life and how you treat others, but it does mean that there is a much broader plan here. You don't need to understand it necessarily, but it is in place. And, no matter how horrible the thing is that's happening here, it's within the context that there is something much greater on the other side waiting for us. And I think that's, obviously very, very comforting. And the fact that God is communicating that to us and wants to have a relationship with us in that way, I think is also unique to Christianity. It's not really a concept that's talked about in a lot of other religions, the personal relationship with God, that you're created in his image and that he cares to know you and cares about you.
One biblical truth that I'll share with you is, and it kind of shatters people's minds, is the God of this world is actually the devil. There's one true God, and there's many gods. There's false gods, and the devil is the God of this world. So what does that mean? He's behind the media and the culture and the religions of the world that are all, and he's like a fantastic liar. He just kind of gets you off the mark thinking you're living your life, you're enjoying yourself, live for today, all these things, eat, drink, be merry. They sound nice. I've sung the songs when I was a kid. You look back at these songs you sing, you're like, what a sad existence. All we are is just a sack of cells to eat, drink, and be merry. Anyway, I'll leave you with this as a last thought, because I see that you're seeking, and I'm excited for you, and I know that I promised you, like, if you keep seeking, this is actually a promise from God. Forget me. If you seek him, you'll find him. And you're seeking, you're gonna find him in your time. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited for you, and I'm always available if you want to talk or have questions. But a saying I heard once that was brilliant is, the longest distance in the world is the distance between a man's head and his heart. And for a long time, these truths and these evidences were parked in my head, and it took a while to punch into my heart. And that's when the change happens. And the love pours in, and the hope, and the grace, and the mercy, and then the fruit comes. Then you live differently, and everything's different. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree, and I think this is the most important question I've asked myself, and is really the most important question anyone can ask themselves in life is whether or not this is true, and whether or not you should start living your life in the way that you should, if it is true. So I just want to say that I really deeply appreciate your guidance and all of the time you've taken to speak with me and resources you've shared and your own story and all of that. This has been a fascinating journey for me, and I'm certainly nowhere near close to finished. But it's something that I can feel myself getting closer and closer. I think, I'm kind of at the point you just described where you're starting to realize that this is objectively true in your head and considering what that means is as far as how you live your life. So that's kind of where I'm at in my journey, and we'll certainly be continuing. And again, just really appreciate all of your time and guidance.
It's been a pleasure getting to know you and hope to continue to do so. And you're at the spot where a lot of people get to, where intellectually they're completely satisfied and then they just got to make a decision. But I'm excited for you, man. And I appreciate you coming on, being honest. I think a lot of people will be blessed by hearing this. So take care and we'll talk soon.
Sing it!
Thanks for joining us for another episode. I hope I got you thinking and out of your comfort zone. Believe me, the biggest fear your government has is a population that is thinking and talking to one another. So get out there, take a risk, start a conversation, make a friend, and reason with each other. Share the show with someone who you think needs to hear it. I wish you peace and love.